You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Home Field Apparel.
Saw the games,
physical basketball
I was at the games.
versus
You were
physical
not.
fouling.
You watched them on YouTube. I saw the games. I watched the games.
Well, we're here. I'm Bob Motes. Welcome to X's and Joe's, a podcast dedicated to decoding the winning formula in college basketball.
And I'm Mike Weemuth. Welcome you to episode 16. Is the blue blood job really dead? Recorded on the afternoon of September 1st, 2024. So, Bob, they say in podcasts, when podcasts typically mature, the guest list tends to move from people familiar to the host to folks that are less familiar to the host. And I guess I'm happy to report that X's and Joe's seems to be going in the complete opposite direction of that with today's guest.
What else is new? We like advancing in the opposite direction. Usually, exactly. It's kind of our homage to different military operations of the past.
Exactly, but we're proudly marching forward in reverse.
Once again, I feel as if I'm being surrounded by people from the western part of Indiana, where the sycamores reign supreme, and they can't figure out what mascot they're going to use there on any given week. One time it was a stump, and I can say that because my parents graduated there, the Indiana State diploma on the wall for my wife for graduate work. But yeah, welcome, Beau. I mean, it's good, but it's always good to have more exposure to the great land of the Haute.
Exactly. Yeah, just as a formal introduction, today's guest is Beau Haynes. Beau is one of my oldest and dearest friends from Terre Haute. I think you would say that if you took all the time I've spent talking basketball with people over the years, Bob would rank number one from 1998 to now. And Beau would rank number one from 1998 going backwards. So I have two of my favorite basketball. Derogatory. Yes.
Could we have actually cured cancer with the time we spent doing this? I mean, something like that. I mean, like the Manhattan Project took less man hours. I'm not really sure here.
Exactly. I think I'm sure some small communicable disease could have been solved by the time we've dedicated. So.
Well, thank you for having me, gentlemen.
Yeah. And also,
it's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. And just a little bit of background on Beau. Beau is an IU undergrad from 1999. Is that right? Or 2000?
Yes.
99.
I did a victory lap.
Yeah.
Yes.
And Beau finished law school at Loyola University in New Orleans, where he is now an adjunct professor of law. And for his day job, he is a healthcare attorney in the greater New Orleans area. And perhaps his greatest credential, he has the undisputed best-looking shooting form of all of our high school pals from the Terre Haute North class of 1994.
Yes,
and that's been voted on.
Yeah, yeah. Unfortunately, though, I was about 5'9" and maybe 105 pounds from 7th grade through my junior year. So my prospects at Terre Haute North were somewhat limited, particularly, and I was made redundant pretty quickly.
Understood completely. I just had the conversation. There weren't too many needs for 5'11", 60% free throw shooting power forwards in Columbus East in 1993.
Right.
I get it.
Yeah. Well, and you'll remember, Mike. So when we started high school, North in Terre Haute is just sophomore, junior, senior, right? And
that's right. Yeah.
And if they offered a sport in your junior high, which is 7th, 8th, 9th, you had to play that sport there. So I played freshman basketball. And then after the season, a select few would get invited to kind of sit on the bench at the JV at North. And they changed that rule. And so I think our junior year, the freshmen, even though they weren't on campus, could come up and play. And there was two freshmen that were probably 4 inches taller than me and could do what, Mike was a very good shooter as well, could do what we do, except they were much better, much stronger, much more athletic. So again, back to
that's all they had going for them. Was better than you.
Yes, back to my severance payment that I got there.
Well, we need to get a video of you, Beau, shooting so that people can see this.
Sure.
So, I think if you can get Jesse or someone to record you, because I've already hyped this, and so I think people need to see what we're talking about here.
Well, I will. I'll get my 13-year-old. He would probably enjoy being the camera person. And as of right now, it appears I've at least passed that one talent or skill onto him. Everything else he gets from my wife.
Yeah. Yeah. I think if we ever expand our list out for invites, we need to get Jason Williams and the
Yes.
chicker. We need to get a video
Yes.
of Jason taking his shot, because that,
Yes.
although yours is most elegant, his is probably described else otherwise.
Well, if there's the eighth wonder of the world in terms of basketball shots, it would be a close race between Kareem's skyhook, Jordan's fadeaway, and the chicker.
Yeah, exactly.
I got to see this.
Yeah,
You're telling me I got to see this.
Exactly.
I need to experience this firsthand. Almost is what I'm.
Jason listens to the show, and I'm sure he's driving through Silver Creek right now. What? What are they talking about?
Well, yeah. The best part is you have to yell "chicker" when you shoot it. Am I
It's
remembering
not
that
official
right?
unless you yell it exactly.
I get it.
So,
So anyway, going on to home field, Beau, I see you're wearing a home field hat. Is that true?
I am. I have the Little Five Indiana University Student Foundation hat, as well as I have the IU. I don't know if you can see that on camera, but I have the IU Kentucky High School All-Star Game shirt ringer tee. So for any of y'all remember the movie PCU with draws?
Yep. Yeah.
So I feel like I've doubled down on the don't be the guy that wears the shirt of the band you're going to see in concert. I feel like I've kind of done that. I'm wearing the wardrobe of the sponsor of the podcast that I'm a guest on. So
I wear them. I wear these a lot of, for the shows, because they're just really comfortable. And that's, we talk a lot about how home field is incredibly comfortable to wear. And just, these are not mowing the lawn shirts. These are not, these are definitely going out, and just, if you're lounging around the house on a Sunday like I am, it's perfect for it. And since we're talking about blue bloods, if you talk about a blue blood collection, as we hear the programs we're talking about, hop onto Home Field's app while you're listening or afterwards and just see the, shirts that Kansas has for Fall Gallon, or what Kentucky has in celebrating the 57 team, or the Indiana 76, 81, and 87 national championship ones. I mean, I mentioned my wife has one of the logos from actually right around the turn of the 20th century. One of the original IU logo shirts that she just loves. So yeah, I mean, we're big. We love home field. We loved home field before we started this. We love home field now, and I just give it a shot. You see, I've got the bison on, and because as an homage to the movement that we need to bring him back. So it's one of those deals that now that football season started, also, it's time to dust it off and get going.
Great. And you'll find all the good retro wear at homefieldapparel.com.
So when we return from the brief break here, we're going to have Beau. Beau's going to come here and talk about kind of finishing up an episode arc that we've been doing over the summer, really about looking back in college basketball and basketball programs, and kind of culminating in this episode, we're going to talk about the Blue Bloods. So when we get back, we're going to dive right into that conversation about Blue Bloods and what makes them blue.
Welcome back to X's and Joe's. I'm Mike Weemuth, joined by Coach Bob Moats and our special guest, Beau Haynes. So in our recent prior episodes, we discussed program history and how it's impacted the teams looking backwards. Today might be more of an insight on how that dynamic will work in the present environment in college basketball. Things like NIL and the portal starting to become even more prevalent in terms of how programs are constructing their rosters. So, Beau, you sent us a really good summary a few weeks ago in prep for this show, and it was a perfect timing for us because we just done the prep for the Galen episode about Bob Knight and the episode about how a program's history impacts their present, and then you come along and say, "Here's a look at Blue Bloods overall and what they are."
And even as we talked about Hoosiers too. That was big for us also.
Yes.
That was just understanding the cultural contextualization.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no, and I'm I hear you all talk about history a lot, political, military, or otherwise, and I kind of was I'm obvious and am a college basketball history nut. I I'm sure both of you and many of your listeners, loved A Season on the Brink, but then I love John Feinstein's books on college basketball. So it was kind of what always has me kind of thinking about history and kind of where we've come, in this sport. And so, A Season on the Brink, A Season Inside, A March to Madness, a sneaky good one is The Last Amateurs about the Patriot League. And then he wrote one about Valvano, Smith, and Coach K called The Legends Club. And so all of that. And then Seth Davis is also very good. He wrote When March Went Mad about the Larry Bird Magic, Indiana State, Michigan State game. And all of that has kind of informed, my views and some of my conversations with Mike, pre 1998, as you said. And so regardless of what you think of Feinstein or Davis's, analysts or talking heads, I mean, they really are great to understand, the timeline of college basketball. And that, is kind of what had me suggest this as a topic. I'll be honest, I was probably in a couple of my double IPAs during the NCAA tournament and during kind of when the musical chairs was going on. In terms of the college search season and the whole kind of domino effect that we'll talk about later from, SMU to USC to Arkansas to Kentucky, that kind of gave me the idea to suggest this in a Discord to you and Bob. Mm-hmm. And so with that background, what is a blue blood, right? I think there's two definitions that I chose that I think will kind of hopefully guide our conversation. One is a blue blood is someone that has been assigned nobility or a certain social status with no guarantee of any particular merit, competence, or expertise. The second is you all used, in the run sheet, a social register, or the term social register, is a directory or book that lists the names, addresses, and other information of people who are prominent in a given area's fashionable society. So that leads us to where we are now. I would argue that there really are only currently I'll say three blue bloods that have really kind of made it from every era of college basketball to the present. Okay. Mm-hmm. And I think that's Carolina, Kansas, and begrudgingly, I'll say Kentucky.
Yeah.
And the reason I say that is because if you look at, they've never really had a true low, or if they have, it hasn't been for a long period of time, and they've continued to evolve either purposefully or by accident over the different iterations of the game, right? In terms of style, some of the things we're going to talk about where the game is today. And, I find that really interesting when you talk about, their Final Four appearances in almost every decade, the number of Final Four appearances, which I don't think you can really, that was one question I was going to put to you. Like, would you all define a blue blood by the number of national championships, or the number of Final Four appearances? I would say Final Four appearances.
I honestly, it's one of those things where it's almost like if you call yourself a blue blood, you're a blue blood, and if anybody believes you, that's the mark.
Right.
I also look at the Chevy Chase definition of blue bloods, which are you're a potato plant where your most interesting part of you is underground, when he was describing his own mother's side of his family. And it's like, well, what the hell have you done for me lately? So when we talk about this, and I think Final Four, I think you look at conference championships as another possibility there. You look at conference championships, you look at Final Fours, you look at national championships. Like a UConn, for example, can say, hey, you know what? We came over on the Mayflower. We may be a little late bloomer, but they have a bunch of Yankee conference championships back in the 60s and 70s they can point to before the Big East. And those are kind of those. I think a lot of it is how you define yourself, and you never really lose the status, but you can still live under a bridge. You may be living under a bridge, but you can be a Rockefeller. I think we talk about that here every once in a while. But I think you kind of hit the nail on the head where it's like there are some things that point to what got you there, whether it was a Helms Trophy in the 20s or a Final Four in the 50s, or you were just, if you see your team on newsreels from the 30s, probably there.
That's a great point.
Yeah, I would say I agree with Bob. I would probably I think that applies like Final Fours, conference championships. Those apply especially to basketball fans, people who are observant of the game day to day.
Right.
I think when it comes to sort of with more casual fans or people who are not necessarily big into basketball, I think national championships are far more important because that's what people kind of like notice, I guess, more prominently than anything else. People, like my wife will not know who won the SEC last year, but she knows who won the national championship. I think a lot of people who follow like March Madness are kind of the same way, like the casual March Madness people that just fill out the brackets. Like, oh yeah, didn't Kansas win like 2 years ago? So I think, yeah, it's almost like the difference between like people who follow basketball intently and versus like, the population in general. And yeah, but I think that really like, when we talk about this stuff, it is really just about status and perception. I mean, again, like what your definition, Beau, was really good because it kind of implied that it's not necessarily unearned, but maybe it was earned in the past and it's not really valid today.
Right.
And out here in the East Coast, I know you and I discussed this before, like in Philadelphia, if you say someone's a blue blood, that means their grandparents earned all the money and they're just living off the interest.
Correct.
Or it also, or it also, even say, does it also just imply that you're probably uncool? Like if you're hitting your blue blood status and that's your biggest, the one thing you say is, here's my membership in the Mayflower Society and my
Metropolitan Club.
Right, exactly. And I was legacied in, I got to be in this fraternity or sorority because my great grandmother was a charter member at the institution, sort of thing.
Right.
And they're like, yeah, he's a legacy. And they're throwing the beer at the screen, sort of thing. But yeah, I mean, I think it almost implies that you're uncool. It's like, what? But have you done anything since, I don't know, Chuck Taylor's became like fashion statements, not basketball shoes?
Right. It's like, and this will be our first Caddyshack reference, but it's Judge Schmelz, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
He's probably been on the bench too long, and then he's, and his whole life centers around his Bushwood membership, right? Yeah. And unfortunately, I hate to say this, I hope I'm not ridiculed. I'm sure I will be, but if you look at the two definitions, like, I think IU basketball, UCLA basketball, and probably Notre Dame football, Nebraska football. And I'm saying this having grown up, in kind of the end of the golden era of Notre Dame football, right? And the tail end of, or the kind of, you call it, I think, the breaking away years, Bob, but for IU basketball, where you had, like I jokingly call it, I don't think this is some unique thing, but the reverse starter jacket, where it was the Notre Dame one in the fall, and then you reversed it to an IU starter jacket in the winter for basketball. And like, and that always hangs with me from childhood, but like there really hasn't been anything from 87 on that really kind of allows IU to kind of stay on that social registry as an example.
Yeah.
Right. And I mean, and again, it is a thing of, you have some moments here and there.
Yes.
But it isn't this consistent sort of like, it's not like the Ford family running the Ford Motor Company, where there's always a Ford in waiting. It's almost like there's this, now we're in what we would call, I would say, a 40-year gap, probably a 30-year gap, really, where it's just been kind of hints here and there. Yes. It doesn't diminish your fandom. It doesn't diminish who you think you are. It doesn't diminish what you may be capable of. Right. But it does, you have to kind of account for that when you're having the conversation, which is, the Kentucky fan might have a point when they say, well, your last banner was the first year of the 3-point line.
Right.
I mean, there's something to be said if you're relying on that, on something that happened before most anybody, 40 years ago, it kind of puts you in a rough spot.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead. So I'm sorry.
Yeah. I think it's, that the time element's always kind of the weird one, right? Is because when people talk about it, I think everyone's trying to, I guess, have one designation that sort of like explains everything, right? So when we talk about, blue blood, elite, whatever, I always like look at it thinking it in terms of time. Like when I think of like blue blood, I'm always thinking past.
Right.
And I think elite describes what's happening now and possibly going forward. Now those are two sort of like different axes if you think about it. Like you can be elite and a blue blood at the same time. That would be like Kansas, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
You can be a blue blood and not elite, and that would be like Indiana and UCLA.
Yes.
You can be elite and not a blue blood, and that would be like, I don't know, name Florida. Florida under Billy Donovan, or or any team that just kind of like in the last 10 years have gotten really good, but we're not, known as being a basketball program prior to that. So I think the definition of terms is interesting. Then you're right, like that the time factor is just so odd in terms of how people.
And Leonard, real quick, Leonard Hamilton said it best. We're a new blood, not a blue blood, about Florida State.
Yes.
Targeting that. So
Well, and I think that's UCLA is a great example too on the time factor, right? I mean, it's the John Wooden era. And then they, Gene Bartow rode kind of the coattails of the Wooden era, I think, for a Final Four appearance. Then you had, a 20-year gap, Jim Herrick with the O'Bannon brothers in 95. And then you had the, Final Four three-peat with Howland. And then just recently you had Cronin. But I mean, make that runner-up run, but you don't really, they really haven't, it's really kind of defined to John Wooden, which kind of brings up, Mike, I know you've mentioned this and you talk about elite, right? Like, I also think elite is, too big to fail, right? And I think, Carolina, Kentucky, Kansas, I think are in that category. I think, however, I will say that I think Duke, I'll put Carolina in there, and then Villanova are in an interesting transitional phase where we're going to see if they're too big to fail, right? Coming off recent elite success, right? Yeah. And so, and then, the other thing, you talk about blue bloods, and you're right. You think about, you're basing off the success of the people that, are no longer with us, that we're, benefiting from. What about those that came to the party later? Like you mentioned, like Duke, I would argue kind of came to the party a little bit later. I mean, they had some success, pre, Krzyzewski, but I mean, really everything, everything really kind of emanated out of the Krzyzewski era. And I mean, they had what, I think, 3 or 4 Final Fours through 78 with that. Was it Bill Foster?
Bill Foster.
And then everything after that is Krzyzewski, obviously, and it'll be interesting to kind of see where they go with Shire. The one thing, and kind of prepping for this, that I did not know, I read it, was I did not know before Foster and whoever resigned or retired at Duke, they made an offer to Adolph Rupp, and he was going to be the coach if his son could be his successor. But then I guess they ran a farm, and the manager of the farm passed away, and they needed to tend to that business. And so he had to turn the job down, which, that would have been an interesting kind of, sliding door scenario.
And it really would have been. But I think it's that sort of thing where when we go back and we look at historically what could have happened, we go down the rabbit holes and you go into that with that sort of alternative history. Yeah. And you kind of go, okay, so this domino falls, that domino falls, and here we go. I think it also kind of just leads us to that conversation where we as fans, when we look at this from a fan perspective, what are the expectations? What standards are we setting? Does fandom inside a program set? And I think that the criteria at, let's say, Indiana is different than, let's say, at Notre Dame for basketball. Just like I think Notre Dame football is different than Indiana football in that regard. And then also that translates to the program itself, how it manages itself, how it looks at itself. How are we looking at the maintenance of those standards, and how do you get it either back in touch with them or out of touch with them?
You're right. And so that's a great kind of segue to that discussion. I mean, you all obviously reference the barber shop from Hoosiers, right? And I kind of mentioned to you guys, or do y'all, sorry, I've adopted y'all, I guess you guys as the Midwestern, so I've moved to the y'all, which I get made fun of.
Remember, for adopting. I'm south of US 40, north of US 50. We go either way. You guys and y'all, I can go either way on that. Go south of US 50 at y'all and a moon pie. I can do that.
So, I had mentioned too, it's like, I think the blue blood fan, right, whether it's a school that falls in the elite status or just the blue blood fan, like, they obviously have high expectations, right? But they see it as having to happen a certain way with a certain type of player and a certain coach. And I think preferably it is someone that is from the blue blood line of the school or from a blue blood line of a different school. And so I think Kansas is a great example, because they kind of are interwoven between, Kentucky, UCLA, North Carolina, and then obviously Kansas, between Naismith, Fog Allen, Dean Smith, Larry Brown, Adolph Rupp, Roy Williams. It's really kind of fascinating to kind of see how that bloodline kind of merges.
It's like the 14th century European court, basically.
Well, remember, with blue blood status, there is a little bit of what you would call selective marrying.
Yes.
Not to go into the Gone with the Wind thing, but the Wilkes only marry their first cousins sort of thing. It's like
Or the Plantagenet Kings of England.
And as IU fans, we look at Kentucky and ask, okay, see, now I could seg in that one. Take that for what it's worth. But
well, and I think for whether we're talking about SEC football or blue blood college basketball, I mean, I think it all starts with culture, right? And I think the fans want their culture to be strong. It shapes and hopefully breeds continuity and consistency, which then leads to championships. And I think that is probably an idea that the modern fan, or I guess maybe some of the folks like us who are firmly inside the Gen X, generation, probably need to kind of get out of our minds, as if we're going to still watch and enjoy and embrace college basketball, that's gone away. And then with IU, I think there was an extra kind of C, so to speak. So you had culture, continuity, consistency, championship. And for IU being the attorney, you had compliance, right? And like, we had to do it the right way, baby. Like, we're not like the other folks. And that, I think that was a limiting factor.
Certainly.
And so, but I think with NIL, and we'll probably hit this in a different segment, with NIL, the transfer portal, conference reconfiguration, I think all of that is just out the window. And so
when Al Cervic showed up at Bushward, the reaction of Judge Smales was kind of this is kind of where I'm thinking on some of this, and that inside fandom, you do have the Ty Webbs out there that say, you know what, my father hated you, and that you get to see that break. But I think you're kind of referencing that a little bit there, like when a Kelvin Sampson shows up to town in Indiana, all of a sudden the Smales family's like,
right.
What are we doing?
Well, and I think we've had that throughout the history of college basketball. It's just been measured and temporary. So, I think the late 80s through probably the early 90s was like the golden era, again, going back to, the three of us as Gen Xers and, huge IU fans. But if you think about it, you had University of Houston with, Drexler and Akeem. You had Louisville with, the Doctors and Dunk. You had obviously Tarkanian. If there's anyone that's not more Al Cervic than Tarkanian, Dale Brown at LSU, kind of just guys that were, probably playing fast and loose. Dale Brown, obviously being in the middle of SEC country is like still very much idolized here, but at the same time, my law school classmates who are diehard LSU sports fans are like, oh yeah, but he couldn't coach, but he made, a couple Final Fours, and he got some, he was very charismatic. He built a brand, right? Between, Chris Jackson and Shaq and Stanley Roberts, all the way to Randy Livingston. I think the Al Cervics kind of came in bits and pieces and waves. I would even argue to some extent, the Flying Illini, with that late 80s Final Four run with Henson and Kenny Battle and,
Marcus Liberty, Nick Anderson,
Marcus Liberty.
Unreal.
Yes. Yeah. So, I think the Al Cervics have already been there. I just think now the opportunity for I think the Al Cervics are more like the caddy swim.
Yep.
and it's not from 1 to 115. It's from we're junior members.
We need the dues.
Yeah.
From another one. Yeah.
Right.
But Beau, if that's true, the Baby Ruth bar, would that be a representation of the NCAA infraction committee?
Yeah, right. Well, see,
like everyone's having fun.
Clear it out, clean it up.
And then all of a sudden that comes in, and then everyone leaves the pool.
Yeah, well, or like, yes. So, I just think it's more about, you ask about what the fans want. And I think it's a little bit of there's a little bit of a get off my lawn versus I'm ready to win at all costs versus, can we please, for the love of God, play a modern style basketball and actually at least consider analytics. Right. And I think the programs that are willing to embrace all those things are going to develop that culture, consistency, continuity, obviously championships. I think Danny Hurley's the best example. Like I would say UConn is the new Carolina, or has the potential to be. Yeah. In terms of longevity going forward.
I would agree. And again, just geographically speaking, with what they can do in the Northeast and knowing that who else up there, my father-in-law's a Providence grad. Some of his classmates would probably argue, well, we could do this at Providence. I don't know if you could. I think UConn, because of where New York City basketball and college basketball is because of their history. I don't see Boston College, even with their incredible New Balance deal, is going to ever be in that sort of realm. So you're strategically located in a very hot basketball part of the country, with the ability maybe to even look overseas or other places in the country and just kind of build what UCLA built. Hurley could build what UCLA built at UConn very easily, just based on what he's got in his backyard and the ability of that program to stretch. So there's a lot to be said for what you're saying with them. And again, you look at, okay, so a blue blood is, well, we're the they may be vanguard compared to using another 80s reference, the brothers from Trading Places, where it's like,
the Dukes.
Oh, wait, that's perfect. That's almost perfect.
You almost planned that.
So, the Dukes. And it's like Mortimer and Randolph sitting there. It's like, well, we've been on this as we founded the exchange. Who gives a hell? We just put you out of business. And you can kind of see that sort of vanguard sort of mindset coming in at this point but we got the shares. We're going to run this thing the way we want to run it. So there's a lot with that. And so a lot of it depends on when you're looking for your coach and how these blue bloods work differently. Like, speaking of, Bloomington, when we go back to the Bloomington, we think about coaching. I always talk about the Pope, as, a papal, like the white smoke. But I was thinking about with this episode, thinking about the Dalai Lama and thinking about Kunga, his nephew, who used to drive a fish truck around the Bloomington area back in the 80s. And his brother was the one who owned, I believe, started the the Snow Lion. And for those of you who don't know, the Dalai Lama's brother was a longtime professor at Indiana University, Bloomington. And there is a large Tibetan community. That's one reason why the Dalai Lama would always show up in Bloomington to give a speech about once every 2 years, because he would see the family.
And his motorcade once almost ran me off the road on Smith Road.
Really?
I was going up and down. You got kind of that back end around behind the mall. I was going and out of nowhere, like this presidential level,
yeah, he has a pretty
SUVs came zooming by and literally ran me off the road. I was like, what the hell is that? There's a little bit of tension. I think sometimes when the Dalai Lama shows up to town, the mainland Chinese students who are there, there's always a question. But yeah, I was not very zen in my reaction to the Dalai Lama.
I'm sure you weren't, but this actually kind of fits into the concept of reincarnation, Mike. That where the Dalai Lama. And the way Kunga described it, I believe to my mother or maybe my uncle, I can't remember which, because he was delivering fish to this restaurant in Nashville 30 plus years ago. I remember the story. He said, well, they waited for the old Dalai Lama. The sign they looked for is when he sat him on the throne, and when he slumped over, that was the direction they sent the priest out to go look for a kid. And that's when they found his uncle and then ran through the process. And so it's kind of fits that sometimes with blue bloods, where they're kind of like waiting for some sort of sign to see where they're going. And you kind of notice that on message boards, how blue bloods look at that a little differently than, let's say, when Iowa was ready to make a replacement for, Licklider. It's like they're not really, we're gonna take the best deal possible versus let's wait for a sign from the heavens to make a determination.
Yeah. Because I guess they don't have that. Yeah, you're right. Because they don't really have that sense of culture that's built up, that's successful. And like Beau says, I mean, when you win enough, then you kind of build a kind of muscle memory inside the brains of your own fans. And they will just revert to that, especially when things are not going well in the program. Oh no, we're losing now. Well, what was going on when we were winning? Oh, well, 20 years ago, we were doing it this way. Oh, well, let's find someone that does that, or someone from that, tree or, coaching tree. So yeah, there's almost like a strange path dependence that takes place when you go through those transitions, especially when it's like a situation where a coach is being fired for performance.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's absolutely right. And you brought that up, like the muscle memory. And I mean, this is probably a topic for another episode is, when with all the ups and downs of the various coaching searches, the various iterations of the coaching searches after Bob Knight, the barbershop talked a lot about those those things that are in the muscle memory bucket, right? Like we need an ex-player, we need somebody who understands IU, we need somebody who plays the right way, defense, compliance, etc. But if you go back and read Season on the Brink, like you can see that some of the issues that were complained about with Crean, Davis, Sampson, all the way Archie, all the way through Woodson were present in that program. And Season on the Brink obviously brought it to the forefront. But I think we've kind of, we only want to remember the good things, right? The halo effect of Bob Knight. So, and so I think that would be an interesting discussion. Is the Season on the Brink and compared to our kind of, how we think of Bob Knight now, right? And the, reality and the legend don't always kind of intersect.
Well, that'll be our next episode with Galen.
I think so.
Yeah.
But to look at it in a different context, because taking another film into play, Disney doing a wonderful job with the movie Glory Road. I can only imagine somebody sitting in the Kentucky SID office at that point going, "Oh no, we got to do something quick," because all of a sudden, who gets portrayed as the villain? Their guy with the halo. They're not seeing Adolph Rupp as the guy that mumbled into the microphone drinking an RC Cola on a Saturday morning or a Sunday morning on the coach's show. Yeah. They're putting him in a position where, and especially with where Kentucky has tacked, I would say since, Joby Hall, but even going definitely with Pitino and Calipari, where they're heavy in the New York marketplace. They're heavy in other areas where it's like, we don't want a whole generation of upcoming players seeing this and going, but look what Kentucky is, and that's, I think, sometimes where a blue blood has to be very deft. And it's almost sometimes like when you start talking about blue blood coaching hires, it looks more like the Godfather than it does anything else, because, okay, well, we're going to hand the family over to Sonny, but he got Swiss cheesed over in Missouri. I think about Quinn Snyder at Duke. He just gets gunned down by multiple Tommy guns. Fredo just doesn't have it. And we got to go with the kid. So Shire, okay, we never wanted this for you, John, but here you are. You have to step up for the family and avenge what's happened and lead the family into legitimacy, or lead the family on after what we built here. And I think sometimes when we look at these types of these changes of, okay, so where do we switch the history? Where do we kind of tack the history and move it forward? Because we don't necessarily want an outsider, but sometimes we got to go outside to do this. Right. Which again kind of comes into, well, would you bring Tom Hagen in to run the family sort of thing?
Right. No, and that's a great point. One offshoot, you mentioned Glory Road. That was actually filmed in New Orleans the summer after I graduated law school, and there was a casting call for 20 to 28-year-olds, which I was in that range at the time, who had basketball experience. And I seriously contemplated, Mike, back to your point about the, if I can just get a couple of the pretty lefty shots to go down, maybe. But it was also like a week before the bar exam. And, my the better angels got the best of my, I guess, inner demons. And I chose practicality over just trying to take a shot of being an extra in that movie.
Now, Beau, were they casting for Kentucky players?
I'm sure. I think they were casting for everything, but
that would have been interesting for you.
Yeah,
Beau Haynes is right. Beau Haynes is Pat Riley on this.
Right. But to your point on like how are these hires different? I agree with you. It's very interesting to see where the traditional kind of the too big to fail programs have gone. I think, again, Kansas is interesting because obviously you had Fog Allen, you had obviously Dr. Naismith, right. But the era that doesn't really get talked about, who I didn't even know who this person was, is like 64 to 83 is Ted Owens, He made a couple Final Fours, had a couple back-to-back losing seasons, and then they hired Larry Brown, right, from North Carolina. Sure. He brings in a title, leaves town as the NCAA is showing up, and so, I think Kansas is interesting. And then they go to Roy, and Roy was a recommendation of Dean Smith, after Larry Brown. But I mean, think about just in the context, if you have a blue blood and, they're taking the recommendation of Dean Smith, obviously a Kansas alum, but on a, little known, assistant who'd never coached anything or never played. I don't think Roy even played college basketball, if I remember right. And I don't know that would necessarily happen today. UCLA, same way. They went after Wooden, they went the lateral route to Gene Bartow. Mike had mentioned that I'd forgotten about this, that he came from Illinois, right?
Yeah.
And that was with some mixed success. I think there's a little bit of some, you're riding the coattails of Wooden. And then they go to Larry Brown, and then they kind of go dormant. Carolina, I think, has probably done it the best way because Dean had a plan and I think was ready to retire, right? And it was supposed to be Guthridge, I think, was always going to get the gig for a couple years. I think Bob, you had mentioned that in some of our other discussions. And there's so much talent there that, that was going to work. And then, Roy wasn't ready, wanted to stay with the Collison recruiting class, right?
Yeah.
Kansas. And then, a couple speed bumps, but still okay in terms of talent. Roy finally comes over and, they've had that kind of continuity and that success over the last 20 years. IU, I think, is, the example of the too big to, or it wasn't too big to fail because the coach was bigger than the program. He was obviously left before he wanted to. And I think, everybody knows that story. We don't need to repeat that, but I mean, there just wasn't a succession plan. And then Kentucky, to throw in another Caddyshack reference, which seems to be our theme here, and is, I think Kentucky is interesting because they had some pretty low lows but high highs. And I don't, you mentioned it before, I don't know that a Rick Pitino, if you told the barbershop, the Kentucky version of the barbershop in, the late 80s,
a bourbon shop.
Yeah, right.
Right.
That Pitino's going to take over for Sutton, but then he ended up becoming beloved, leaves. Tubby kind of gets the
bears the brunt.
I'm in the first chair and kind of has some success riding the coattails of Pitino, although I think he was a very good coach. Then they make the mistake on Billy Clyde. And then, they end up, and they pass on Calipari, right? And so, then they get to Calipari, who, just was a non-starter, right? And, when they moved on from Tubby. But the thing about Calipari, for the Caddyshack reference, I feel like Kentucky fans are the priest when they're playing the round during the storm. So when they first hired him, that's Kentucky. It's this is the greatest round of my life. And then when the lightning strikes, it's him, sitting there, probably way too much into his bourbon, telling people there is no God. And I feel like that's 2015 to last year with Calipari and Kentucky fans.
when he said, I was on HBO or something, and we'll kind of lead out with this here, to our break.
Yeah.
But he said something to the effect of, well, we're getting guys to the NBA, and I've won my one. It doesn't really matter if we're national championships. I think that speaks to your point, Beau. He said that on a documentary or something. They were doing a documentary on the Kentucky, Calipari. They were, or one of those HBO mini. I don't remember where I watched it. We've got an ESPN. Something. I'm hearing him saying this. I'm like, your fans can hear you say this.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of a bridge to where we are now, right? Where he was more interested in, and instead of talking about wins, championships, Final Fours, the things that the bourbon shop would want to hear. He's
Right.
talking about total contract value for all his players over the 10 years he was at Kentucky, which is very impressive.
I'm changing lives, and that's
Yes.
nice. That's
Yes.
great. No, not nice. It's wonderful. Don't get me wrong. And
Yeah.
teaching them how not to run themselves into the ground financially and all the things.
Yes. But I think, to a certain segment of the fan base, it was, but we're not winning to what our expectations are because we're Kentucky.
And what you promised us when you walked into the teleprompter and you gave gave a campaign speech to tell us your nomination speech to be the Kentucky or your inaugural or one of those, it was some sort of combination, standing there in the middle of Rupp Arena saying, I will bring us national championship after national championship. So when we get back, we're going to kind of delve into that sort of the designation because and whether or not they matter, and really talking about why a guy like John Calipari would pack his bags for Lexington and move to Fayetteville. So when we come back on X's and Joe's.
Welcome back to X's and Joe's. I'm Mike Weemuth, joined by Coach Bob Moats and our special guest, Beau Haynes. So, Beau, we've, I guess in the past 2 or 3 months, Bob and I have kind of gone over the conversation about, what winning in your past actually, what value that has, looking at today. And so that's more obviously, a program and maybe even like a coach specific kind of conversation. But I guess, in terms of the designation, because we're talking about blue bloods, this is really what I talked about in one of the prior episodes about branding, like your program being seen as being a blue blood. In your mind, do you think that matters today? And what do you see, I guess, as the variables and the sort of the dynamics of how being a blue blood today actually plays in terms of the win-loss column for a team?
So I'm not sure it matters for all the things that y'all have touched on. Galen has touched on, the assembly call guys have touched on in terms of where college basketball is today. I think between NIL and the portal and the conference realignment, I think the ingredients are there for, more, I'll say non-traditional basketball schools like in Alabama or a Tennessee or, a Texas, even though they've, always had the money, or you move to the Big East where it's a basketball only school, basketball only schools now. I mean, I think, the opportunity for Villanova, UConn, obviously, to be attractive to a coach over, a traditional blue blood job. I think when you see some of these coaching search, I think the easiest thing for us to go back to is the Tony Bennett kind of passing on IU for Virginia.
Right.
Yeah.
The other one I brought up before is and again, it kind of shows that I think there were coaches that subscribed to this. But Rick Barnes is a great example, right? He was at Providence. Dave Gavitt was there, took him to a Final Four. We know what Pitino did with Billy Donovan in '87. Mm-hmm. And then Rick Barnes came in after Pitino left for the Knicks and was dubbed Rick 2, which I don't think he particularly liked. But he actually moved on from Providence because he, which I think is more of a blue blood than any of his other jobs, and wanted to go to Clemson to build Clemson because it was in the ACC. Yeah. It was a football school. And so, and he would make his mark on a program that had very little history. And then obviously goes to Texas, takes him to a Final Four, is fired, and then now is doing wonderful things as we've seen with Tennessee. So, I don't know that, and actually, and we'll touch on this later, Seth Davis had written an article about Oates in Alabama and said, he could have entertained the Kentucky job, but he was like, I'd rather do it here. Not that he goes, I put the expectation on myself to get to the Final Four every year. So being at Kentucky, where it's expected by the fans every year, wouldn't have been any different. But I would like to put my imprint on a program that doesn't have that history. But all the other ingredients are there, right? You're in the SEC. There's obviously money. The expectations are a little different because it's a quote unquote football school. And so, the light doesn't shine as bright. So those are some, and so I think that's always been interesting. I think now, and then with some of the musical chairs this last spring, right? I mean, Scott Drew wanting to stay at Baylor.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, Gonzaga, I think we haven't really mentioned Gonzaga yet, but Mark Few wanting to stay there. And I think they could kind of sneak into the blue blood conversation as well, quite frankly, if we kind of put a flag in the ground of, I'll use your term, Bob, like the breaking it away years. And let's say 1982, if we recalibrated our blue blood list, like who would be on it, right? And so I think these jobs are a little bit fluid in terms of how they're seen and what the coach particularly wants. Calipari leaving for Arkansas.
Yeah.
So
which was almost would have been unheard of, I think.
Yes.
20 or 40 years ago. I mean, could you see that possibility where Tubby Smith would have replaced Nolan Richardson? There may be a world where that happens. Right. But I'm not really bought into that necessarily. Because I think that the conventional wisdom is you take a blue blood over because I can win here. That's always been the thing about the IU job is I think every coach says, well, I could win at Indiana. But then the other question is, do you really want to be staring back at a ghost the whole time? Or
exactly
in the case on some of these, like if you're replacing Jay Wright and you're Kyle Neptune, you're following a legend. There's an old adage. I mean, Mike, you're an HR guy. Isn't it better to follow a corpse versus a legend?
Right.
Yeah.
I look a hell of a lot more competent if the last guy ran the thing. It's like, if you take over the captain of the Olympia, you're going to look a lot better because of the Titanic. It's that sort of thing where as long as I don't ram the thing into an iceberg, I'm having a good day. And that I think is where some of this stuff where it's like, I wouldn't call it pressure because I think these guys most of these guys thrive on pressure, but I think Beau, you hit the nail on the head. If I can win somewhere else and I have and especially when we start talking about revenue sharing and you start talking about NIL money coming in with those two factors, I can now portal and get kids coming into my institution. Rick Barnes kind of set that model up of I can turn a football school into a basketball with a strong basketball program.
Right.
Well, all three of those programs are built football schools, but he can win there.
Yep. Yeah. And if you go back to, Will Wade as an example, he wanted an SEC football school basketball job, right? He wanted that LSU job. Yeah. And I think if he had gotten the opportunity, if some kind of dominoes had fallen some different ways, I think you could have seen him at Ole Miss if Beard had left for Arkansas, as was rumored.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
it's kind of interesting. Like you think about, Bob, our episode was it like a few months back or a few weeks back, I don't remember, where we were talking about like the history of, each program, did it matter? We were mentioning some of the variables of what the advantages that the elite programs, the elite winning programs had over the programs that didn't win. And I mentioned things like, media coverage. Like if you were a player, let's say you're in California and you're going out to the Midwest or the East Coast, if you didn't go to like Indiana or Kentucky and you were playing, your folks back home would not know what you did the night before in the game unless you went to Indiana or Kentucky. Right. They wouldn't get like the Sports Illustrated cover, unless you went to a place like Indiana, Kentucky, North Carolina. And there's just all these other advantages we talked about then that programs that let's say in the 70s had some kind of like huge advantage over all the non-elite programs. Those advantages are no longer there anymore, or at least they've diluted at least to a significant degree.
Yeah.
Like, the advantage, let's say that like North Carolina, Indiana, Kentucky, these programs, they still get better media coverage than an average program. It's just the advantage is much less than it was in the 70s. So it's like, taking a big advantage and just like shrinking it down to that much. So there's still an advantage. It's diluted to this point. And I think, what you and Beau both said, I think is accurate, is that when you take like an elite job, there's always sort of like the benefits you get, from taking the job, the advantages of taking that job. And then there are the disadvantages, like, the disadvantages being like the pressure, the scrutiny, the fishbowl environment that, some talked about with Chris Holtman considering the IU job. You look at those advantages, and in the environment where now those advantages are going down, now for some of these coaches looking at that, the disadvantages and advantages at a big school, or at least a historically relevant school, they're going to be about even for some of them. In fact, maybe the disadvantages actually jump above the advantages. And so I think that's, what Beau's sort of pointing out is an interesting dynamic where the reduction in the benefits to the elite programs is sufficient to where now the side-by-side comparison to like an SEC football school.
Right.
Yeah. Now today, that SEC football school looks much better because I can get all the money I need that I would get at an elite school, but I don't get all the crap that comes with going to an elite school.
Right. And all the rules are out the window, which I probably could have worked around at an SEC football school, let's say in the mid to late 80s or even the early aughts. And now everybody's on the same playing field. And I think technology, right? Whether that's how, social media and kind of, Mike, to your point, like the world is flat, right? The coverage is, 24/7. Somebody's going to find you, and the brand awareness, which we may talk about in the next part of this segment, is more about the player and what they're looking for than the brand that is the school and the power of that. And if Danny Hurley can get on his private jet, and fly to, the Midwest and then to the West Coast and then back to see a bunch of kids, like those regional recruiting advantages that I think y'all have referenced, right, in prior episodes, that's out the window, and it really kind of levels the playing field. I mean, on some other IU related, podcasts or articles that have been written, or even in the Season on the Brink, they talk about, whether they're former players or John Feinstein kind of talking about it, is like, Knight was kind of into recruiting, kind of not, like, but at the same time, it wasn't that hard. He could go to, Illinois, Ohio, Indiana, sit down in the family's living room, do his pitch, and then maybe the assistants would have some kind of follow-up touch points. But at the end of the day, like, if you hear, to a person, the anecdote always is like, I got a phone call from Coach Knight, and it basically like, you're coming to Indiana, right? Like, that's the end. Or at the end of my recruiting visit, I walked into the, the bowels of Assembly Hall, and there was, one chair sitting in the middle of the, the leather recliner or whatever. And it's Knight, and be like, so you're coming, right? I mean, and that's all he had to do. Yeah. And because, it was a certain type of kid from that generation that worked on. Right. And as you all talked about, especially on Galen's, guest appearance on y'all's podcast, was that, while Knight was an early kind of, he was a revolutionary to what modern basketball was in the late 60s, early 70s, in terms of man-to-man defense and motion offense. Like, he didn't evolve towards the end, right? Which is a typical career arc of anyone, a C-suite executive, a lawyer or whatever. And so it was, and the comments made in the Season on the Brink about Delray Brooks. And he said, you had to be a Knight person. And they said Delray absolutely was, in terms of the type of kid that Knight wanted at Indiana, but you had to be a Knight player too. Right. And he just couldn't adapt. And then you all mentioned Andre Patterson, great kid, right? Like he was our era, great kid. But where basketball was going, even though he was a McDonald's All-American, he wasn't really, he was a wing that could stretch the floor and probably would have been better suited for Kentucky at that time than Indiana. But he was a McDonald's All-American, which means we should have been able to kind of, shape shift him into, taking us to that, that next Final Four, which obviously didn't materialize.
Well, and I mean, it also comes down to, and again, as we kind of look at that dynamic of players and coming up, and also the whole idea of the blue blood, that, when you look at those closing scenes in Caddyshack where, Noonan decides to go with Ty Webb and Cervix says, I'm going to make it worth your while, versus the whole, but Judge Smales is offering you a whole world that you don't want to live in. It's at this point, you're Danny Noonan and you're seeing this. These are means to an end. Yeah. You're, me being Judge Smales's, for lack of a better term, lackey, is not kind of the thing. Because if you look at the three young people in Judge Smales's life, the niece, who basically is just out, she's all over the place as so to go. But Spalding,
Lacey, that's Lacey Underalls, by the way. For you, Caddy.
For you, Caddyshack. Yeah, Lacey Underalls, which is again,
niece, right?
Yeah, the niece.
Yeah, that's right.
Who was there because she kept getting into trouble back home. Yeah. And then there she is, finding Chevy Chase's, or finding Ty Webb's, summons. It's like, those two end up right where they should. But it's that whole thing of, you have Spalding and you have, who is just that kid that just expects it all. But then you also have Danny Noonan, who sees all this whole thing of college basketball, this whole thing of golf or college basketball. These are means to an end. And my end is I want to go to college and I want to be better. And I also don't want to take your crap. Is really what it comes down to. At the end of it, he felt like he had to take Judge Smales because that was his best route, until there he is holding the bag and Cervix goes, I'll make it worth your while. And I think for a kid, that history is kind of like having to eat all that crap. You're like, whenever I hear a recruit interview and they say, I just really admire the history, what else? They really are, those fans are really passionate. I'm like, oh, we're in trouble, because at this point, all they're doing is backwards looking. If they're talking about how this guy can get me to the league, or this is a great environment, this is a great environment for me to develop my game, or all these other things, or even talking about even campus life is superior. I have a chance to not only just play basketball here, but to also develop myself as a human. Whatever those other code things are, when it's just basically going, they have a great history, a rich history. It's like, oh, geez, we're Judge Smales again. When in reality, being Al Cervix or even Ty Webb, where how do you measure yourself? By height. It's like, I don't really care about, I know I'm going to win regardless. I just care about the process. And the process for me is I go out here because, well, what else am I going to do with my time? And that, I think, to me, is like those 18-year-old kids we're talking about. Do they really care about the history? I don't know. They might, but they may not. It really doesn't really.
That's a great point.
Yeah, my theory has always been that they don't care about the history, but they appreciate all of the secondary effects of the history, which is the fans. Like, if you took two programs, give one success, let's say 30 years ago, and another one failure, well, the successful one's probably going to have a nicer arena, is going to have more fans show up, going to have better NIL resources. So yeah, it's the direct link. No, the secondary links. Yes.
Yeah. And you're right. So if you lined up two opportunities in front of a kid today, and NIL and scheme and, campus life and, all the things were equal, right? Playing time, development for a hopefully a future professional career in basketball. And then, oh wait, one of them is, whatever. I don't know, St. John's, and one of them is, Kentucky or North Carolina. they're going to go obviously with Kentucky or North Carolina, you would think,
Right.
and down here in Louisiana, we call it, it's a little lanyap, a little something else on top, right? That brand power is maybe something that might nudge, the blue blood, to the finish line ahead of a St. John's or a Butler or what have you. Yeah. That's probably not a good example to use the Big East, but you got to get the concept there. So.
But I do think that because as we kind of go into this idea of how some of those programs have broken into the locker room, so to speak.
Yes.
How some of them have convinced the nomination committee to, no longer be blackballed. And you look at a guy like Scott Drew or a guy like Bruce Pearl, who have been blackballed by the coaching, I don't think you should date him, honey, sort of thing. When you think with programs, when they look at those guys going out of their areas for a long time, they were kind of like, well, I just don't think he's a good fit for our family. So, you can't have him as your husband. We don't want to bring him to the Thanksgiving table. How those guys have kind of broken in, among others who may have been suitable, but it's like, well, we're not really sure he fits. Some are fully blackballed, others are kind of like suggested no's. And they've found a way to be successful regardless.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. And I mean, like Judge Smales, I think, is everything we've already talked about, right? The traditional blue bloods, whether they're still elite today or not, right? The Ty Webbs, as you've mentioned, like I kind of look at that as maybe like an NC State with Valvano, who's like, I'm a member. I know there's more to life. I know there's more to golf, more to my life than Bushwood and golf, right? Like, how do you measure people? My height, like you just said, right? Or it's like just kind of indifferent to the whole thing. And I mean, that's kind of how Valvano was. I mean, Feinstein writes about him a lot. That he just was questioning, is this all there is after 83, right? And so, so I think kind of back to an early point I made, I feel like you've kind of had these programs kind of jump in and out of that blue blood, country club locker room, right? Or elite, right? But today you're right. Like, to think that a Baylor or a Gonzaga or, would be kind of what they're viewed as in terms of, their success over the last few, couple decade or so, and their ability to compete for talent. Like if you had said that in, while we were at IU, we would have laughed. Right. And so I really think it's interesting. Michigan State's interesting. Like, what do you guys, do you see them as kind of already there? Because I kind of wonder if they are Dr. Beeper. Like,
yeah, exactly.
Honestly, it's kind of like I'm a doctor. Like, I'm a basketball school. We've been to a lot of Final Fours, but for right now, my focus is, just stick a tube down her throat and I'll be there in 5 or 6 hours because I'm getting ready to tee off, right? The practice of medicine, the coaching of basketball is no longer, I kind of feel like Izzo's getting there, right?
He's the perfect playing partner with Judge Smales, honestly, when you think about the perfect playing partner with Smales, because of Michigan State's perfect because he's not going to really offend you. He's not going to make, and he's going to back you in the whole coaching fraternity tradition thing. Even though he'll always just be kind of sergeant at arms on the board meeting, he'll never be the chairman of the place, but he will be there for you when you need him for that key vote or that sort of key thing. Right. And he'll beat you on the course, but it's okay because he's kind of one of us. But he's never going to be fully enshrined. And that's kind of, I think, how Sparty kind of jumps into this. I think there are times where you can make the same case for Michigan too in that area where they're kind of that back.
Or Louisville. I mean, what do y'all think about Louisville? I mean, they've got a lot of Final Four appearances and two-ish championships, depending on whether you see the third one is valid.
It is. Hey, I believe that vacated titles are just as good. They just got caught speeding.
I agree. 100% agree.
Yeah. There's an interesting bullpen of programs that are sort of sub-elite, but are clearly like separated from everyone else, right? And I think it'd be interesting to almost track over time. And I've kind of done these kind of studies before, where you almost do have like programs like Louisville or Michigan State or Michigan, where it seems like if they just get the right coach, then they kind of pop up. But then once that coach kind of leaves, then they just have to get lucky again, and otherwise they kind of return back to sort of that sort of like in holding stage of their program.
Yeah, you just hit the nail on the head, Mike. Can you retain your guy? And you guys, you're Terre Haute guys. You know the conversation about Josh Schurz when he left. It's like, you guys understand.
Oh, yes,
like,
we do.
As much as Terre Haute wanted to just hand the city over to him, and it just wasn't going to happen, because there was a point where you have to have a certain infrastructure in place that would hold a guy like that there. And the question becomes for a lot of programs, like let's say, Cal Neptune will always be Villanova's an ending destination. But if you're sitting at, let's say, the guy that replaces Leonard Hamilton at Florida State, and he just hits fire, would they be able to retain him for the long period of time? Or maybe the best example in the coaching ranks right now is Micah Shrewsbury at Notre Dame.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yep.
The day will come where he's going to have the choice. And the choice is, will Notre Dame, because he already made the choice with Penn State. Penn State already kind of said, no, well, we'll talk about, Pat Kraft said, we'll talk about it when the time comes. He's like, my agent's on the phone now, and Notre Dame will hire me right now with exactly what I want. But then when that next conversation comes through of, well, can I win a national title at Notre Dame in basketball? Maybe not. Maybe I can find some place that's going to give me a little more as to what I can put in place to actually be at the top of my profession versus in the conversation at the top of my profession. Because Dusty May had that conversation at Florida Atlantic. He's like, you know what? Sell out. I'm out of here. Let's go. It wasn't easy, but he did it.
Yeah. It's kind of it's like, Thomas Carlyle has the great man theory of history. Whereas the idea that, okay, you can look at history and just like identify a small number of guys, or in some cases women, but there are like these key characters that come along that just sort of like break history one way or the other for, a nation, or for this case in basketball, like I think it applies to programs, is that, okay, you hire the right guy, and for now, the next 20, 30 years, you're going to be X. But if you don't hire them, you're going to be Y. Mm-hmm. And I think the timelines are going to change now, because I don't think like the 30-year tenures are really going to be as prevalent as they used to be. But, we joked about that, example of that Wisconsin athletic director before. The guy literally brought in a young Bo Schembechler and a young Bob Knight. And somehow decided not to take them.
Not my guy.
Which, great benefit to the University of Michigan and Indiana University. Right. But obviously it kept Wisconsin stuck in 30 more years of the dregs until Barry comes along and, pushes them to where they are now. But you think about it. If that guy had just simply made a different decision, okay, yes, Coach Knight, you will coach our basketball team, and yes, Coach Schembechler, you'll coach our football team. Think how much different things could have been right now. Just the whole history of the conference would be completely upturned.
Well, and I think that kind of goes to, you're like kind of the sliding doors, decisions, right? But like on the, on one level, like today, again, the whole landscape's fluid, as we've seen with the house settlement, like I said, NIL, transfer portal, the ability to harness resources that maybe were always there and available under the surface, but we weren't allowed to, or we didn't have the equipment to harvest them. We can now just go all in terms of financial resources. But I think it's interesting, even if you look at the last few years. I mean, we had that blue blood Final Four in 2022, or let's use your term, Mike, elite. Right, you had Carolina, Villanova, Duke, Kansas, right? But then look at kind of what's sandwiched around that. You had UCLA and Baylor. You had Texas Tech make a run. Virginia wins its title. San Diego State, obviously Florida Atlantic. So what I would, I guess, kind of put forth is that kind of shows evidence that we're kind of moving towards what we're talking about here today is not, it's kind of anyone can do it, right? Like, I mean, and if all those ingredients are in place and everyone seems to have the recipe right in front of them and the ability to at least go to the grocery, use the parcels line, if I'm making the meal, I want to go shop for the groceries. Well, all that's lined up for these programs to have success if they're willing to commit to it.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect segue, Beau, because the next segment, we'll be talking about exactly that. We'll be talking about looking forward. Will the modern dynamics of basketball allow for blue bloods to exist the same way they used to in the past? So that'll be coming right up next on X's and Joes.
So, Beau, as we kind of wrap this up, I know Mike and I have kind of had the conversation. Yes, your history matters. We've actually kind of gone into what pratfalls you can go into over the course of this summer. But I think that there is an argument that says, we look at the idea of, is this job dead? Maybe not dead, but has definitely something where maybe the playing field's leveled a bit.
Yeah, so that's a great point. This kind of gets to, I guess, my PCU thesis of you can find a Michael Caine, Gene Hackman movie on 24 hours a day at any time, and so there's a great Jeff Borzello article on ESPN that kind of talks about that 3-week coaching search. This last April. Well, actually, it starts with SMU firing Rob Lanier, right? Yep. And then, but really what they talk about is SMU going to the ACC and how the AD at SMU sold the ACC on the Dallas market, the resources at SMU, looking at the changing landscape of college athletics in general, and then obviously the ACC going and getting, Cal and Stanford, and I think I'm forgetting one more. And so, it's kind of a microcosm of what we're saying, across all of college athletics. And so when they went to the ACC, then there's a movement for SMU to want to invest in its basketball program, maybe a little bit differently. But I think more importantly to what we're talking about is SMU now had the ability to go get a better coach. Not that Rob Lanier was bad. I mean, I think they're on target to make the tournament this year and, maybe fizzled at the end. And so they go to Andy Enfield. And it's interesting the comments you read in the article, like, the AD at SMU is like, well, we weren't going to make this move unless we could get our coach, a coach that we knew had proven success at a high level. And I'm sitting there thinking, that was Andy Enfield. I know he's a great coach.
Had moments. He had great moments. But USC is hard. USC is hard.
Yes. And so, but, I know he had the, what was it, Dunk University or whatever it was with Gulf Coast. And, obviously very bright guy, good coach, but then it kind of recontextualizes this whole conversation. Like, that's what I'm thinking with my old school, like kind of IU barbershop mentality. Like, well, there's only a few coaches that have true success that you would make that move on. And then Andy Enfield says, there's no way I would have considered this job except for SMU is going to the ACC. And it actually says something very similar to what Nate Oates said about not going to Kentucky or considering it. Was I wanted to be the first coach to walk into the ACC with SMU and put my imprint on SMU and be a coach in a ACC, in the ACC, right? Well, so then that those two dominoes fall, right?
Yep.
And then you've got Musbus always wanted to go back to California. He goes.
Yep.
Then Arkansas opens up. Arky. That's my, I guess that's my SEC, slang coming out. And then Calipari kind of gets wooed by the Tyson Chicken money and maybe just a reset on his career, the loss to Oakland, right? At which then opened, which you never would, we've already mentioned it, like never would have seen that domino fall, right? Going in conference to what is probably considered a step down. Well, it's considered a step down, maybe historically under the barbershop thought process, right? And now Kentucky's open, right? And where do they take their swings at to start with? They kick the tires on Jay Wright. They talked to Danny Hurley. Scott Drew is an actual candidate. I think they talked to Billy Donovan.
Yep.
Rumors were he bought a horse farm, outside Lexington.
Doesn't he own one outside of Spencer? I heard he runs one outside of Spencer, Indiana, too. He's got there's a horse farm everywhere, and Billy Donovan owns it.
But what they ended up, and so obviously, none of that came to fruition. But then they get Mark Pope, and then Oates doesn't want it, and then Oates kind of goes through like why he doesn't want it in that Seth Davis article, and it's basically like, I was a math teacher and a high school coach for like 10 years. I would say like, he and Hurley, I think have really embraced all the things that are today's college basketball, right? From conference realignment to analytics to modern offense, and in that article with Seth Davis, which is really interesting, which I know IU fans would love. It's their shot chart from last year and everything's at the rim or at the 3-point line. And I'm like, and he's like, look, I'm a math teacher by trade. Like and then he makes an interesting comment. Oates does. He goes, if you sit here and complain about where the sport's going, that train has left the station. So you've got to kind of figure out how to work within it to be successful. And I think that's a perfect attitude. I think Calipari is probably going to Arkansas to kind of reset with that view. But then interestingly enough, I would say Pope actually fits what the bourbon shop wants.
Absolutely.
Bloodline, but he also aligns with, modern basketball. He's a character. He's going to build culture. You got your continuity and you got championships, which will lead me to my conclusion. And then maybe we can all kind of discuss it is, I don't think it's about a blue blood job anymore. I think it's about getting the right job in probably what is a blue blood conference, meaning Big Ten, SEC, ACC, maybe Big 12. I mean, I think that's what it comes down to.
I'd agree with that. I would agree that you can make something into something. I think the question is, and if you guys, I think all three of us are on Trilly's Discord, and we may have heard the Tom Crean, where he's talking about the changing calculus of assistant coaches. I mean, Tony brought this up a couple times, I think on Twitter, where now you need guys who are less likely to, I've got a phone with all these contacts of AAU coaches who can get us talent. Now you need guys who also have just as many contacts of guys who will write me a $10,000 check. Crowd, and he even used the term crowd or friend raising as you need people on your staff who can friend raise as well as do all the other portions of the job that are necessary. And I would agree that if you can, you can build something at an institution. I think your institutional culture still makes a big difference. Like the guys that play at the municipal golf course every day, they love to play golf, but they're going to look at it differently than the guys that play at Bushwood. And they're going to be like, well, we can do, we're just as, and that's, I look at Purdue, for example, is a good example of this, because I don't think Purdue's ever going to have that. I should rephrase that. Purdue right now is not looking like they're going to build the infrastructure that other institutions are going to build in the game for something, let's say, like revenue sharing at the levels that I think other programs are looking to build. They're going to do this. They're going to go away. They're going to go against the grain in this because they know that they feel like their brand is strong enough to do it. We'll see if they're successful. But whereas Indiana, we're going to find every person in Indiana that's willing to give you $100 and up. and we're going to fund as many of these kids as humanly possible because we really have that in our DNA. We just know we've choked it down for way too long.
Yes.
So that, in that regard, it's a question of, I think it's an indirect conversation to the blue blood idea, which is, okay, are we willing to do what it takes to get back to the top? Are we willing to do the things under the rules, and in our culture to make this happen? And I think if the answer is yes, that's one thing. But I think you can do this a lot of places. And I think it's also a thing like we're seeing in the pros where there's going to be a lot of, it's going to be like an old NASCAR race on a super speedway back when they used to pass on the track. You will still see a lot of passing where, this guy, they get hung out to dry and they're going behind. And then they find a way to get themselves, work their way back up to the front of the field. I think we're going to see a lot more of that over time. But I would tend to agree that, being a blue blood has some advantages, but those advantages have been mitigated by the changing landscape.
Yeah. I also think, do you think that, I won't say ego, but let's just say in the coaching psychology, there's a tendency for guys to want to be seen as sort of the face of the program, not just like now, but like historically. I've heard that from when you see, I remember when like Bobby Bowden passed away, 2 years ago, and they talked to all these coaches and they said, well, Bobby Bowden built that program. And they all sort of repeated the same thing. And you heard the same thing when they talk about people that build a basketball program. You can tell in their eye, there's that twinkle God, I'd like to build a program. I want to be I want my name to be the top of the list of a program that won because of me. They would not have won without me, and I think there's a little bit of that in some coaches' mind when they think about, okay, I could go to an elite program, but the Mount Rushmore is already there. I'll just be the fifth head, in the
Mike, real quick. Oklahoma State. What will they name after you?
Yeah.
A urinal? Yeah. I mean, at that point, you've got just a urinal left to name after you.
Exactly.
The floor and the arena have all been named for guys in the Naismith Hall of Fame. So I see your point.
Yeah, no, exactly. And so I think that's part of it. In addition to what we said before, is the idea that whatever advantages were derived from being an elite program have I won't say mostly, have incrementally melted away to where that whatever advantages are there now are just not sufficient to overcome all the crap you get for being at elite program when it comes to the crazy fan base, crazy expectations. It's just the balance is now just come where the line here is now just popped just a little bit below. And so now people don't like that gap anymore.
Yeah.
Oh, no, I think you're right. I think you're right, though. I think and when you say conference, I think just with the money and with the realignment and everything that's going on, I think that's a very interesting and probably accurate point, because what's really going to get crazy in the future is what happens to programs that were considered P5 that are now no longer technically P5.
Right.
Would you take a coach like Tony Bennett may have taken the Washington State job a decade ago or two.
Right.
Would you still take that now that they're the Pac-2?
Nope.
Right. No, not at all. But I mean, there's also so many more jobs that I think he would not have considered moving from Washington State to Virginia that he'd probably consider now. Yeah. Because they're all crammed into these, P2 conferences. Right. I mean, it really isn't. I mean, it's going to be fun. It's fun to come. I mean, and one thing we haven't touched on is look at some of these player journeys, right? Dalton Connect. I mean, junior college with Northern Colorado, and then, chooses Tennessee over IU. In what world, again, going back to kind of our era of the barbershop, is that should have never have happened, right? But that's kind of the mindset we're trying to change. I get why he went there. It proved out well to be true.
Worked out well for the kid.
Did you watch that Miami Florida football game yesterday?
I did not. I went at the same time as IU.
Yeah, I was popping back and forth. Yeah.
I didn't move. I stayed on IU because I wanted to see what the Coach Heater era looked like.
Exactly. So Cam Ward, the quarterback from Miami, who may have actually taken a little bit of a nice step towards the Heisman Trophy, absolutely lit Florida on fire.
Yeah.
And he started out at Incarnate Word.
Jeez.
Right? I mean, that's
so he goes to Incarnate Word, then he goes to, I think he went to Washington. He actually went to Washington State, I think, and then jumped over to Miami. So you're right. I mean, the pathways that these kids are taking are just completely non-traditional to what we've been used to.
Or even like, I mean, I know it's coach related, but I mean, look at all the James Madison kids we got.
Right.
Like, do we even look at those kids in a, mid to late 80s, mid 90s? I mean, from a IU football perspective, or at least a Big Ten program worthy in terms of talent.
Yeah.
Our quarterback comes from from Ohio University. My brother-in-law sends me, because that's where he graduated. Met his wife Emily. They met in Athens, Ohio. I have 2 nieces there currently. I've been to Athens, Ohio, multiple times now, and it's a nice little college town. It's like Bloomington with a Kirkwood about a quarter of the size, but it's not the same. But I would say that I mean we took a guy from OU, and he's now starting quarterback in the Big Ten. Just because and so there is that sort of moving up, and also guys that are moving down. I think Christian Lander type of conversation where it's like water is going to find its level now in this new hierarchy much more easily.
Yeah, but I think the cool thing about it is the kids can find their pathway one way or the other, and there's no restrictions on them, wanting to chart a new course. As there was before. So, anyway.
So in many respects, we can kind of wrap this up with a conversation about the Cinderella story. That the Cinderella story is now a reality. And I would like to note that we have actually used Caddyshack for about a little over 90 minutes of references.
Yes.
And we haven't gotten to Bill Murray's Carl Spackler character. Or the Gopher. I mean, to be perfectly honest, I don't know if this would be metaphysically possible for us to for anybody to have a Caddyshack story, which I think we should get like I don't know, put a banner up I'm going to put a banner up saying 90 minutes without a Spackler reference, because I mean, and it all worked, but it's like when we think about this, it's like how do you describe the world, the world where you have the Cinderella story? I think we just kind of talked about that there a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that if the Bushwood physical golf course was the college sports landscape, then Spackler is the NCAA, winning the Masters in the flower bed, thinking everything's just fine. Everything's fine.
Or saying, I don't think the heavy stuff's coming down yet.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly.
We're all, walk, as Congress is yelling at him, walking away, slinking off back to his garage.
Yeah, and then set the course on fire.
Yeah. And then the Scottish groundkeeper is kind of, you're right, like the NCAA or the FBI being like, you need to do something about this. And we saw how that worked out.
Varmint Kong. Varmint Kong.
That's great.
Beau, seriously, thank you for coming on the show.
This has been so much fun, guys. Yeah, this has been so much fun. I appreciate you entertaining my crazy thoughts and ideas, and I hope they weren't too crazy, but this was a lot of fun. I really appreciate y'all having me.
Absolutely. No, and I'm sure Beau will be talking offline, but this was fun. Yeah. This was definitely fun for me. I mean, I almost had more fun just watching this than participating. the 2 characters involved. So this is definitely good entertainment for me.
Yeah, so if you're scoring at home, there were 2 PCU references and about 25 Caddyshack references, right?
Yeah, that's not bad.
And again, I snuck in the Godfather. I always try to find a way in every episode to snoop the Godfather.
Oh yeah, you did that. Yeah,
exactly. All right.
So thanks again, Beau, and thanks again to our good friend to our Bob Thompson for the music you hear and the sound you hear of the show. And special thanks to John Rigger of rigdesign.com for designing the logo and look of the show.
Yeah. And for the next episode, Bob and I will be looking at football. Season's finally here, and this will be our first conversation about football, right, Bob? We have not had any formal
30 years that we ever talked about. Oh yeah. Well, no, we're going to call this the football show because we really we're just going to chat about football for a few minutes.
Yeah, we have no idea what we'll be getting into, but it will be football related. So we feel like we had to squeeze at least one football episode in at some point. And I think it will be coming out probably about 2 weeks. So I think you'll have at least 3 football weekends in before we get to this conversation, which I think actually works because with so much tumult and change going on in college football, I think it's almost impossible to have any reasonable conversation about any program until you get at least 2 or 3 games in. So I think
I'd like to talk about it after IU plays in the Rose Bowl for the first time in my life.
Exactly. Beau, are you going to that game?
I am right now scheduled to go. So
yeah, that's what I thought.
Awesome.
Awesome. For the same reason you just identified, Bob. I want to see the Hoosiers
in the Rose Bowl.
Yes.
Well, now you have to send us pictures, by the way.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes.
We will post those on the show when after you send them to us.
I'll absolutely do that.
Okay, great. All right, this endless conversation was brought to you by the Back Home Network. Be sure to check out all the great BHN content, including Assembly Call, Doing the Work, Right Up Meridian, The Dribble Drive, and Crimson Cast on YouTube and BackHomeNetwork.com. Until next time, I'm Mike Weemuth.
And I'm Bob Motes.
Have a good one, everybody.